On the 27th of August 1941, the crew of a 269 Squadron Hudson achieved one of the weirdest feats in Coastal Command history. They forced a U-boat to surrender from the air with nothing more than a couple of machine guns.
We attacked 4 times and were just getting ready to dive the 5th time when they decided they'd had enough of it. They stuck a white rag out of the conning tower or something and waved it violently.
What's more, they then managed to have the enemy vessel captured and towed to shore. This is the story of how U-570 and its crew managed to get nabbed by the RAF on their first operational sortie. This was in the face of extreme technical failings in the American-built aircraft, which, in most cases, would have made this achievement impossible. What do you think the failure was? The answer coming up in this episode. U-570 in August 1941 was just completing its sea trials around the Norwegian coast and was preparing for its first convoy hunt. Aboard was a crew of largely new recruits, inexperienced in submarine warfare. This included her skipper, the 32-year-old Kapitan Lieutenant Hans Ramlo, who had never commanded an operational U-boat before. On the 24th of August, U-570 left Trondheim and made its way to an area south of Iceland. This voyage was carried out mainly on the surface. It was later reported by some of the crew aboard that on 2 instances they spotted enemy aircraft and were forced to crash dive. A taste of what was to come. As it progressed through the Norwegian Sea, U-570 developed severe engine problems and began taking on water from one of the torpedo tubes. With hasty repairs having been made and the U-boat now in its patrol area, Ramlo received new orders. On the 25th and 26th of August, U-570 had been radioed that another U-boat had sighted a supposedly American-escorted convoy and that 5 ships had already been sunk. The radio messages from base made a great show of how poor the seamanship of the then neutral Americans was. In fact, there were no American vessels escorting convoy OS-4, and for that matter, my research suggests no British ships were lost in the area on those dates. Nevertheless, the rookie crew must have been bolstered by these misleading reports. Ramlo was told to leave his predefined patrol area and make towards the approaching convoy. U-570 was expected to intercept it on the 28th of August. In the meantime, another dozen or so U-boats were congregating in the same area, ready to attack the convoy. Number 269 Squadron, then based at RAF Kalderdans in Iceland, was dedicated to defending the convoys crossing its zone of operation. Convoy escort was a regular task, and the operational record book for this squadron is dominated with this particular role throughout August 1941. On the 25th of August, Pilot Officer Macy and Command of Hudson Y. Yorker sighted and attacked a U-boat heading 290 degrees at 12:50 hours. As the aircraft prepared to attack, the U-boat had crash dived and was submerged before the 2 depth charges hit the sea. This is unlikely to have been U-570. Although they were also sighted by an aircraft on this day, the crew later reported that no attack was made. Could their lack of experience resulted in them incorrectly stating this? It is possible. Pilot Officer Macy's was the first sighting of a U-boat by the squadron that month, and its usual routine of convoy escort was interrupted. Over the following 5 days, almost every aircraft sent out would be conducting anti-shipping sweeps. U-boats were in the area, and 269 was going to find them no matter what. Another U-boat was sighted and attacked on the 26th by the crew of Hudson I Inc. Again, no clear results were seen by the British crew. The following day, Sergeant Mitchell and the crew of Hudson E. Edward came across another U-boat at 0730 hours. The pilot attacked in a dive from 800 down to just 100 feet above the waves. None of the 4 depth charges aboard could be released. This was a problem frequently reported by No. 269 Squadron during this period. Frustrated, the crew radioed back the location of their find, even though the U-boat had already escaped below the waves. Taking off 3 hours later than Hudson E. Edward, squadron leader James Thompson, at the controls of Hudson S. Sugar, was soon told of the U-boats in the area. Weather reports from that day were bad. The sea was rough, the cloud base down to 800 feet in some places, and visibility was reported by some aircraft as being as little as 1 mile. It's a miracle that the crew of S. Sugar found U-570 at all. Though having travelled much of the distance from Trondheim on the surface, the U-boat spent much of the morning of the 27th of August below the waves. Kapitan Leutnant Ramlo had ordered U-570 below the surface around 0830, then some 70 nautical miles off the coast of Iceland, in order to gain some respite from the rough seas. Many of his inexperienced crew were suffering from seasickness. The U-boat then returned to the surface again at 10:50. Ramlo showed his own inexperience now by not taking precautions against hostile aircraft. As he exposed his ship, almost immediately Squadron Leader Thompson and his crew flew over him. Hearing the Hudson, the order to crash dive was immediately given. This is perhaps one of the drills the German crew were most proficient at, despite their limited training, but it was all too late. Thompson whipped his aircraft around, attacking from 100 feet, releasing all his depth charges at once. These straddled the U-boat as it plunged beneath the rough sea, landing within yards of its hull. As the foaming water settled down again, U-570 re-emerged, its bow low in the water. While Thompson brought his aircraft around again, the crew saw a dozen men wearing life vests clambering into the conning tower. They appeared to be going for the gun on the foredeck. Thompson opened up with his fixed forward-firing guns, spraying the heaving deck below. Had it not been so deadly, the confusion of the men bumping into each other on deck would have been amusing. Those above were trying to get below again to escape the bullets, those below were desperately trying to get above as the sound of water rushing into the vessel panicked them.
The Germans were already out of the conning tower, didn't like it a bit, and tried to scramble back again. Others were still trying to get out of the hatch, and they sort of met in the middle and had to argue it out.
As the 269 Squadron aircraft rushed past the U-boat below, another crew member manned the belly gun and started raking the German crew again. With men crammed within what protection the conning tower could offer, the Hudson attacked another 4 times as Ramlo gave the unbelievable order. The order to surrender. This was in direct violation of the Kriegsmarine's battle instructions, which stated no U-boat should ever be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Ramlo's subordinate officers followed his unexpected instructions, something that one of them, Oberleutnant Zerzi Bernhard Berndt, would later pay for with his life. From the cockpit of his Hudson, Squadron Leader Thompson witnessed a never-before-seen sight. Out of the group of cowering men poked a white flag, being vigorously waved against the background of grey sea. Later, no doubt with great amusement, the crew would be told that this flag of surrender was a shirt straight off the back of a fearful sailor. Circling low over U-570, Thompson made sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. More men came aloft and crammed into the conning tower, holding up a large white board. Shocked, the RAF crew now went about deciding exactly how they were going to capture this unfortunate U-boat. Asked if he fancied dropping by parachute to become the U-boat's prize crew, the navigator, Pilot Officer Coleman, unpolitely declined. In fact, Squadron Leader Thompson and his crew weren't witnessing a unique event. 2 submarines had already been forced to surrender to the enemy since the beginning of the war, both of them being British vessels. However, HMS Seal and HMS Shark had both been heavily damaged, and only the former made it into the hands of the Germans, the latter being scuttled by its crew. The reality of the situation, unknown to the German crew, was that S. Sugar had exhausted its supply of depth charges, and had no way of destroying the U-boat should it choose to attempt an escape. When U-570 had crash-dived on hearing the engines of the Hudson, the concussion of the depth charges had totally demoralised the inexperienced crew. Instruments had shattered, some allowing water to flow into the cabin. Gas had spontaneously erupted, and the crew, fearing it was chlorine gas, wanted to surface. Ramlo, just as inexperienced as many of his crew, thought his command was lost. Rather than go down with the ship, he saw captivity as the better option. After the war, his mental state of mind would be called into question, especially when it was revealed the young officer had spent considerable time in a naval psychiatric hospital back in 1939. Above, the Hudson's WAP was desperately signalling for assistance. No Allied vessels were in the area, and it would take 3 hours for another aircraft to arrive to relieve the Hudson. During this period, the crew of S. Sugar circled U-570 on the deck, menacing them with their machine guns and, so Ramno feared, non-existent depth charges. At 13:45, an RAF Catalina, AH-553, flown by Flying Officer Jewis, approached the U-boat. Thinking that perhaps this newcomer was going to attack their prize, Squadron Leader Thompson flew towards it, signalling frantically. Soon the new crew had gotten the message: look after our U-boat. In reality, the message was probably closer to, this bastard is mine. Exhausted, Thompson flew back to RF Cardenans, landing at 15:15. But that was by no means the end of the story. While in most publications, including period newspaper articles, it is the crew of Hudson S. Sugar who get the credit for this amazing feat, 209 Squadron deserve as much of the credit, if not more. Even Thompson acknowledged this himself.
Of course, the job wasn't anything like finished. We'd had the incredible luck to find the U-boat, but the Catalinas kept watch for hours, much longer than we did, through gales and darkness. They stuck to the U-boat magnificently. And then the Navy came along and they put up a grand show too, taking the U-boat in tow and under most difficult conditions and bringing her right into shore with all the crew prisoners.
During the initial 3 hours of their semi-captivity, some of the officers had started to compose themselves. A signal was sent off to Vice Admiral U-boats, explaining that U-570 could no longer submerge, and as a result had been captured. This was all that Germany knew of the fate of U-570 until British newspapers started arriving from the neutral sources. There were some fears over the Allies getting their hands on Kriegsmarine codebooks and being able to decipher messages before Enigma machines could be updated. They needn't have worried. Sensitive documents and equipment aboard were destroyed and thrown overboard. An effort was even made to make repairs to the vessel in order to make good an escape. However, with the water level rising, the ship's pumps failed and the current ran low, shutting off the lighting. This forced the crew to seal off the front compartment to try and keep her afloat. With choppy seas all around, no other ships in sight, the crew huddled on deck rather than risking the life rafts. With the 209 Squadron Catalina overhead and its guns trained on the U-boat, most of the German sailors waited it out in the safety of the conning tower. Some, reportedly, did venture back down in the bows of their ship, and amazingly returned to their bunks to sleep. 8 hours later, at 21:45, Flying Officer Jewis sighted a trawler and signalled to it the position of U-570. Here there are some discrepancies with the series of events, but as much as an hour later, HM trawler Northern Chief finally made contact with the damaged U-boat and delivered an ultimatum. If you make any attempt to scuttle, I will not save anyone and will fire on your rafts and floats. The reply was made, I cannot scuttle or abandon. Save us tomorrow, please. Meanwhile, AH-553 reported that they lost sight of U-570 around 2200 hours, despite dropping flame floats, and began circling to find it again until 0213. At this point, they set course for home and landed at RAF Reykjavik at 0435. It was the end of a 17.5-hour patrol. During this time, a second RAF Catalina from 209 Squadron, AH-530, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Ogle Scan, was also scrambled. It took off at 22:30 hours and made contact with U-570 at 0340. By this time, it reported that a destroyer and 3 ASTs were around the surrendered craft. The crew was being signalled to abandon ship. However, this didn't happen for some time. AH-530 left the scene at 15:25 hours the next day and eventually made it back to base about 2 hours later. U-570 was eventually boarded by men of the Royal Navy and towed to an Icelandic port. There it was evaluated, and it was eventually put into British service as HMS Graf. Initially, Churchill had wanted to give it to the Americans in order to bolster Britain's relationship with the neutral country. Another idea of his was to have the captured submarine operate in the Mediterranean Sea with a Yugoslavian crew. The Royal Navy argued against both these ideas, and so U-570 became HMS Graf, due to all the reports and studies carried out on her. The now British submarine carried out 3 wartime patrols, and its crews reported sinking 1 German U-boat in October 1942 and then a destroyer in January 1943. On both occasions, these were incorrect reports. HMS Graf, née U-570, was decommissioned in June 1943 due to a lack of spare parts. After making an unmanned bid for freedom, the result being it beaching itself on a Scottish island, the ship was abandoned until 1961 when it was finally scrapped. In recognition for the remarkable feat of capturing a U-boat from the air, Squadron Leader Thompson and Flying Officer Coleman were awarded the DFC. Flying Officer Dewis of 209 Squadron received the same award. Sadly, he would be killed before the end of the year, and he has no known grave. If this story was a movie, which it absolutely should be and would be had Hollywood not gotten all the facts wrong, this brings us to the movie within the movie. Early in my research, I uncovered a series of newspaper articles all about the same story, the escape of the captain of the captured German U-boat and him subsequently being shot by a humble member of the Home Guard. In fact, the newspaper reports were wrong. Oberleutnant zur See Bernhard Berndt was not the commander of U-570. Berndt was actually the first lieutenant aboard the captured craft, but he became proxy commander during an illegal court-martial. In an article penned by Edwin Gray for the US Naval Institute, a simple prison escape that went wrong takes on a very sinister twist. After being captured, the crew of U-570 were heavily interrogated, in particular the officers. No doubt the British wanted to discover why this surrender had come about. Perhaps they could induce similar acts in the future. After these rounds of questioning, the men were moved to various POW camps around Britain. The officers were bound for Grisdale Hall. Waiting for them would be a court-martial, entirely illegal in nature, convened by other members of the Kriegsmarine. Although all 4 senior officers of U-570 were expected, Ramlow's arrival had been delayed as he was held for more questioning. The most junior officers were quickly acquitted, eventually deemed to have just been following orders. The first lieutenant did not get off so lightly. The full fury of the court descended on Berndt in the absence of his commanding officer. Having been briefly in command of the vessel while Ramlow had been taken off the U-boat to offer an official surrender, Berndt's lack of action damned him. While a more sympathetic court may have seen that Berndt was in an impossible situation, the one he faced threw the book at him. He was placed under close arrest while the detainees waited for the expected German occupation of Britain. Shortly after the verdict, news reached the camp that U-570 had made it back to Britain and was actually docked in the vicinity of Grisdale Hall. Whether coerced or through his own initiative, a plan was hatched where Berndt would escape the camp to sabotage his own ship. Under the guise of a Dutch merchant sailor, his accent too accented, Berndt was helped to escape by the other prisoners. He managed to get only a few miles before being stopped by a member of the local Home Guard. Though this soldier seemed to believe his story and accepted his forged papers, he was obliged to take him back to Grisdale Hall to verify his identity. Whether determined to carry out his task or fearful of what might befall him at the hands of his own comrades upon failure, Berndt made a run for it. A .303 bullet ended his flight of freedom in seconds. As his funeral was being held, plans to subject Ramlow to the vigours of the same court of honour were already being made. This the British found out about and sent the unfortunate U-boat captain to captivity among Luftwaffe officers near Carlisle instead. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like to help it spread to others. And if you'd like to support me in making more videos in the future, please check out my website with more details, or feel free to show your appreciation with a super thanks below. And as you've made it this far, why not check out the 2 videos on screen? One is the wartime recording of Squadron Leader Thompson, describing the events in his own words, and the other is another amazing story about Coastal Command. It's a good one.